All right, so it's a real pleasure to welcome Bill Murphy, who's the founder of Enterprise Angels and also the Purpose Capital Impact Fund. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your being here because you were in a snowstorm in Dunedin just a few hours ago, right?
I was, and my colleague who works with me in Purpose Capital, who's from Wisconsin, sent me an email and said she was jealous that I was in a snowstorm, and and I actually really enjoyed it too because I'm originally from Boston in the States, and we get lots of snowstorms there, so it was enjoyable from that perspective. But the usual downside of snowstorms and ice is it creates havoc in transportation, and it did for Air New Zealand this morning, but really pleased to get here.
Yeah, and the amazing thing, because I was emailing with you like literally an hour ago, and you were still in Dunedin, but it's a beautiful sunny day here, so it was like, wow, just amazing, isn't it, how weather can throw things out?
Yes, indeed.
So what we're going to do on this podcast is we're going to talk a little bit about you and your background and where you're from, and then we're going to go into sort of what you're doing now, and in particular this impact fund. Like I'm really fascinated. I want to understand sort of the background to it, what you're hoping to do with it, what the future plans are.
Correct.
But if we could just start, let's just rewind to the beginning of your life and just tell us a bit about where you're from.
Great, thank you. Well, as I said, I'm originally from Boston in the States. I come from an Irish Catholic archetype. My father was a policeman. My uncles were both firemen. And if you've ever watched movies about the States and that part of the world, you'll know that that's kind of the storyline usually. So, but
And had your family, had they been there for generations or how long had it? Because it's an old city, right? It's been around for a while.
It's an old city, but my family is not. As like a lot of us that live in Boston, we're relatively new migrants to the United States. So it was my grandparents that came over from Ireland.
Oh, okay.
So my father was first generation. I'm second generation American.
Right.
Yeah.
And your grandparents, did you get to know them and have much to do with them?
I did. Yes, for quite a long time. Yes, because I was one of the oldest grandchildren of 35 cousins. So
wow,
large family.
Yeah. And what was your memories of them and sort of what had led them to move to America?
Probably like a lot of migrants, it was very difficult to get them to talk about Ireland.
Right.
And when we went back to Ireland as a family to do our roots trip, to sort of explore our roots, they didn't come with us.
Right.
And I think one way to explain that is if people are aware that when people left Ireland for generations, they would hold a wake when the person left because conditions were such that nobody dreamed that anyone would be able to afford to come back to Ireland.
Right.
Both the trip and also be able to come back and live in Ireland because conditions were so dire there. So I think in some ways my grandparents had to just put Ireland away, cut that off from their life, and really focus on making a life in America.
That's an amazing mentality, isn't it? Because I've got ancestors who went to America from Norway. It was maybe a little bit earlier, like 1910, and the conditions that they left were very difficult. It's not the way it is today. And for them as well, they never went back. And it was very much a separation of our new life beginning, which I guess for our generations, we jump on a plane and we can easily travel around the world.
Yeah, and we can be romantic, which is fine. We can be romantic about where we come from, but they have memories.
Yeah,
and they're not, and oftentimes not pleasant, unfortunately. But it was great going back to Ireland. We did meet my grandfather's uncle, who was in the IRA, and he showed us the places he blew up, and so it was great fun.
Right.
I was 18 at the time, so yeah, that was very interesting.
Yeah. So you grew up in Boston then. What was that like? What was your childhood like? What type of things did you enjoy?
Yeah, Boston is a interesting city, given that it's based so much on migration, but it also has probably 50 universities in a city which is under a million population.
Right.
So it's kind of a real mix of working class immigrants and extraordinary university, that sort of atmosphere of a university city. I grew up in a suburb just to the south of South Boston called Quincy, And it was the dream of the Irish migrants to Boston. They all ended up living in South Boston. It was their dream to move out of the city if they could, and if you moved to Quincy, you made it. So Quincy was a city of 100,000 people, and yes, that's where I grew up until I left at the age of 20.
Right. And in sort of your childhood and your high school years, maybe, what sort of things did you enjoy?
I was very involved in sports. I went to a Catholic high school. I played ice hockey, ran track and field, American football, baseball, the works, whatever I could do. Yeah, I've always been very interested in sports.
That's
So
great.
that filled up a lot of my time and kept me out of trouble. I then went from high school on to my first year of university. That was fine. That was in a small university locally. I then transferred to a large university, the University of Massachusetts, where I went for a year. And education in the United States is such that you can take a very broad approach in your first 2 years. You don't have to specialize in the first couple of years. And so at the year two, I had no idea what I wanted to major in. And so at that point, I'm not a person who spins their wheels very, very well. I really have to be clear about what I'm doing. So at that point, I left university and hitchhiked across the country to see if the Summer of Love was still going in San Francisco.
Right.
So
what years are we talking then?
Yeah, so we're talking 1974 when I hitchhiked across the States.
Okay. So Woodstock is like 5 years before then?
Yeah, that's right.
Because that was like well, for me anyway, as the next generation coming, that's the event that people kind of talk about. And yeah,
that was the East Coast event, and the West Coast event was San Francisco, Golden State Park, and the whole hippie thing. But by the time I got to San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury, the busiest place in Haight-Ashbury was the free medical clinic, because the hangover had definitely set in from all those years of excess in the 60s. And so it wasn't quite the place it was in the 60s, but it was still a very vibrant and very interesting place in those days.
Yeah. So your decision to do that hitchhiking across the country, like, was that a moment that you made that decision, or it had been building for a while? Or how would you place that in your life story?
It had been building for a while. I was almost none of my family has left the community that we grew up in. I'm one of the very few that has, and I think that was always going to be the case. I just think I always knew that I didn't want to become a policeman. So
right.
So I think I always knew that I was going to leave. It was just a matter of
what set you apart there then from the people who stayed? Like what was it that shaped you that way, or was it just you were born that way?
Yeah, I think probably born that way. Yeah, just a thirst and a desire for something more. Something more. And I think that's characterized my whole life. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's explore that as we get going through the life. So you hitchhiking across the country. What's going through your mind at that point?
Let's see. Being brave. I remember my father. I announced my parents. They knew that I was going to be going, but I announced my parents one morning, this is the day, and my father was home in his police cruiser, in his police car, and he said, "Well, at least let me get," because I was going to just start hitchhiking right from the house.
Right.
He said, "At least let me take you out to the expressway, to the highway." And so I said, okay. And he had a partner with them, two policemen in a police car. So the police car took me out to the highway, and I can remember from my father that was a very sad moment for him, of course, letting go of his eldest son.
Do you remember any of the conversation as he's driving you out?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't remember any of the conversation. I just do remember that was a very memorable moment for me, because I didn't often see my father like that.
Right.
And I realized at that moment how hard it was for both he and my mother, but I also was extremely clear in myself that this was something that I had to do. So so it would have been a very difficult thing for them, having their son hitchhike. I wouldn't accept, a plane trip or a Greyhound bus or anything. I was just going to do it that way. So, yeah. So I had some very interesting pickups and during that trip, but fortunately made it safely eventually to San Francisco. A bit of a detour. I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I had been picked up by a truck driver, and he stayed the night. And for the listeners who have been to the States, if you've been in the middle of the States, you'll know that truck stops there are like mini cities. So he stopped in a truck stop in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I slept next to the cab. He slept in the cab, so I slept outside on the tarmac. And in the morning, he said, "Sorry, I can't take you any further. There's somebody else from my trucking company, and if they see I've got you, then I'll get in trouble."
Right.
So I was stuck in Tulsa. I eventually got picked up by a guy who was going to the north rim of the Grand Canyon to plant trees with a bunch of hippies as a way of saving money to buy a commune in Idaho. And so when we got to Flagstaff, which was the decision point, do I go north with him or do I continue west? I thought, what the heck? So I went for a month with them and planted trees, in the Grand Canyon area.
Interesting. And after that month, you then continued on the journey?
Yes. And
you weren't tempted to go to Idaho?
No, I wasn't. I don't know that I was invited. I can't remember. But yeah, I was headed on to San Francisco. Yeah, and really didn't know anybody there. So started off sleeping in parks and things, but eventually made connections and.
Yeah. So you've had an interesting life already, I can tell, to go from that, because presumably you haven't got much money, right? You're out sleeping in the park, What do you think that did for your mindset or your way of looking at the world?
It was wonderful. It was wonderful freedom. So it was what I was looking for, which was to be free of expectations that I would continue on and fit into the mold of my upbringing. So it was really liberating in that way. I'm sure it was also scary as well, but it was still a time of a lot of turmoil. The Vietnam War was closing out, was just coming to an end, so there was still a lot of turmoil. And I guess I was feeling that and part of that. Just wanting to break free and felt that it was a time when I could do that.
Yeah. So what happens next?
I went to Oregon I'm just trying to remember the name of it, Eugene, Oregon, the University of Oregon, because my roommate at the University of Massachusetts had moved out there. So I lived with my old roommate for a month and cut down trees in Weyerhaeuser forests in Oregon.
Yep.
So that was sort of the alternative or the opposite of what I did on the Grand Canyon, and was there for about a month. And then he had a cousin who lived in San Francisco, and I went to San Francisco to live with his cousin, which was my first place to live in San Francisco.
Right. So how long had you been in Oregon? Just a short time?
Yeah, I think I was only there for about a month.
Right. Yeah. No, it's just coincidences of life, because my father worked for Weyerhaeuser Corporation back in the 1970s. So there might have been a little crossover of paths, because we lived there for about 5 years. Before we came to New Zealand. So there you go. So you end up back in California, and nowadays, Silicon Valley is quite famous, and worldwide tech center and things. What was going on at that time in San Francisco region?
I would have been completely oblivious to any of that. So this was 1975. Yes, I guess Microsoft had started by then. I don't think it had, because I think Bill is younger than me. So, and I'm not even sure if Apple had started yet. No, I'm not. I don't think that they had. So it was pre all of that. The thing that I had in my mind when I went to San Francisco was I was either going to save up money and then go hitchhike all over Europe, or I was going to find a guru. And I found a guru. So this may be an interesting chapter in the story for listeners. Yes. So he was a Westerner. The group had a bookstore in San Francisco, which I used to go to because I was I had already started doing yoga at university, so I was starting to really get interested in those types of things, Eastern religion, and that was part of my exploration of. My exploration wasn't just an exploration of traveling around the world. It was also a real interest in, I guess, what makes us tick, to put
Right.
it in simple terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got involved in that organization for quite a few years, and didn't really pay much attention at all to career or money or any of those things. My priority was living a spiritual life and helping others. And so that was from the age of 20 until I was 33.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Quite a long time.
And
Yeah.
during that time, my wife and I, who's a New Zealander, and who I met a couple of years after that, my wife and I came back to New Zealand in 1980, and we established a bookstore on High Street in Auckland.
Okay.
And we would run courses. We'd run in those days. We would import film in canisters from Australia, and we'd show films on Carl Jung and just a whole range of different topics, everything from psychology through to spirituality, through to a whole range of things. And so it was a center for those types of activities.
Right. And the bookstore became a hub for people who were interested.
Yes, yeah, and if they were particularly interested in what we were involved in, then great, they could seek more information about that.
Yeah. And did that involve community living as well, or was it, or not?
Yeah, there was we owned a property in Northern California, which was what we called a sanctuary. It was an old health spa. It had a lot of hot springs, and so so the group had that land up there. But most of us lived in households, and 2 or 3 families living in a household together, large homes throughout the San Francisco area primarily.
Mm. And when you came back to New Zealand, was it continuing on that thread, the link back with that organization, or was it quite separate? Or?
Yeah, it was continuing on that, and it was working with people who were interested in those types of things here in New Zealand, and running the bookstore. And after 3 years here in New Zealand, we went to the UK and did the same thing there. Opened a bookstore there and worked with people in the UK that were interested.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're going to talk about purpose, and that's kind of a theme of where we're about to head to. Was that obviously it was a time in your life when you were finding purpose, and could you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, I was brought up a Roman Catholic, and I found a lot of the people that were very interested in getting involved in spiritual matters either had a strong Catholic upbringing or Jewish upbringing. It was quite interesting, and I think that sort of sets a course for you may push outside of your conventional religious boundaries, but I think. For those of us that have been brought up in a strong religion, when you go to seek for answers, you may push off a lot of what the religion represented, but you still might seek for those things for some form of a spiritual answers or a spiritual search.
Right.
And that's always been the case for me. So that's the core of who I am. It's also the core of why I do what I do. So and so yes, that does involve meditation as a discipline. It involves not belief systems, but actual practice of and realization of the depth that we are as human beings, our connection to each other, and what we are in what I would say capital truth, which has to do with our consciousness and who we are in beyond our ego and beyond how we typically think of ourselves. There's much more depth to us than what we typically think of ourselves as having. So that really is the wellspring of of me and the work that I do.
Mm. And that's particularly in contrast to sort of the modern Western individualistic view, I guess, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Which is more about how much money am I making and have I got a nice house or a new car?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, so that's right. The expression of that, looks different, I guess, than the way our society runs currently. Indeed.
So you end up back in New Zealand, obviously, because you're here. Can you just describe for us some of the next years and kind of what led you, I guess, to Tauranga and what you've been involved in?
Sure. So we eventually moved back to New Zealand in 1987. And that was a challenging time in New Zealand, the late 80s. So we lived here for 3 years and then moved back to the States and lived in Seattle for 6 years. But I realized quite a long time ago that New Zealand was now home. It really was where my heart was. And so we were always going to come back here. In those years, I went back to university because by that time I had a family and did the most practical degree I could possibly do, which was by no means my passion nor my strength, and that was accounting. And so I qualified as a certified public accountant in the United States, and then when we moved to New Zealand, became a chartered accountant here. And that was really just to add those hard skills to my natural softer skills, but also to hope to put that into the bag and not have to pull that out again as a career, because that really wasn't what really inspired me. But accounting and business has been the path through which I've been able to express change. And so when we came back to New Zealand, and this time it was Tauranga in 1996, I became the general manager of an electronic instrumentation company known as Blue Lab today. That company was sold, the new owner took over, and I could tell he was going to be able to run the show. So I then left and helped establish Priority One, which is the economic development agency in Tauranga, and then went back into a business consultancy. And it was at that point that people looking for investment opportunities and also entrepreneurs looking for investors started to approach me.
Right.
And I realized, oh my gosh, we have no early stage investing ecosystem in New Zealand. At that time, if someone wanted to raise capital, if they were brave enough, they picked up the phone and called the local rich guy. So coming from the States, I was aware of how sophisticated and developed that ecosystem was there, and I just said, we absolutely have to have that here, and I can't imagine why we don't. So 12 years later, we certainly have that in New Zealand now. Certainly, obviously not solely down to me. I was just one of the people that was involved.
Yeah, and the outworking of that became Enterprise Angels?
That's right. Yeah. So Enterprise Angels was formed and we were aware that Ice Angels had been formed in Auckland. So it was to create a group so that we could match up the entrepreneurs with the investment opportunities. Yeah.
And I guess just talk us through that. What are some of the challenges that entrepreneurs are facing in getting access to capital? And then what are some of the challenges that investors face when they come to invest in a company or an organization or whatever?
Sure.
I'm just curious on your perspective, having been involved in that scene for a while.
Yeah. So Enterprise Angels has invested $40 million in 80 companies. So we've had a lot of exposure to lots of different companies. The market here has matured quite a lot. In the early days, most of my work was helping entrepreneurs to understand what investors were going to expect and helping them to prepare themselves to actually approach investors. About 6 years ago, that really started to change, where the entrepreneurs themselves were coming already prepared more and more, and nowadays that's always the case.
Yeah.
So that's been a great sign of maturity in the market.
And by prepared, do you mean that they've got structures which make sense and they've got clear documents that good contracts in place. They've got pitch decks that talk about what they do. That type of preparation.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And they've got a business model, and they also understand the stage that angel investors are most likely to invest, and therefore they wait and they approach at that point.
Right.
So there's a sophisticated understanding as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the challenge for entrepreneurs in raising capital currently in New Zealand. Just the challenges that are always there in having a model that has the potential to really scale, because the risks are so high for early stage business investing that the potential prize, has to also be very, very large, and so that can be a real challenge for New Zealand entrepreneurs to be able to tell that story in a way that investors will come on board. And for investors, the challenge for them, well, first off, valuations, which are tending to be too high in New Zealand. Entrepreneurs will sometimes come to us having looked at valuations in the United States, and will mimic those valuation levels. But what the entrepreneurs are not taking into account is that those entrepreneurs are already in market. They already have their next round of capital people lined up. They've got their customers right where they are, and a whole range of other positive things happening because they are already in market. Our entrepreneurs have to get from New Zealand into those markets.
Right.
And so the cost of that bridge and the risk involved in that bridge of getting into market needs to be reflected in their valuations, and isn't always. So that's usually something that gets investors grumpy.
And I guess picking up on what you said, the potential or the scalability of it, you really need to go to those bigger markets. So that's the hurdle, to go from a New Zealand-based company into the larger, whether it's Europe or the US or other places, isn't it? Like, New Zealand's a great testing place. If you can prove it works here, then it probably will work there. But it's that next stage, isn't it, of
That is.
actually going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. And just talk to us. I'm just really curious about the term angel. Because I work a lot with entrepreneurs and people who are looking for investment, and some of them probably wouldn't describe that early stage capital as, like, angel has really positive connotations, doesn't it? Like coming to save you and help you. But some people might argue that actually that people would come in and take a large chunk of equity without actually giving much back, and impose restrictions and the way things are to be done. What would be your sort of take on it?
Well, the term angel investor comes from Broadway back in the 1920s, I think, when altruistic people would put money up to help put on Broadway plays.
Oh, okay.
And so they were called angel investors. And for some reason, that is what early stage business investors are called. Yeah.
How did it translate from that?
I don't know. Well, I mean, it all depends on which side of the fence you're on. You often act for the entrepreneur, and so there's a view from that side of the fence. The investors have a view from their side.
Yeah.
I think that investors coming on board and not providing a lot besides money is more prevalent with investors who we might call simply high net worth individuals, rather than angel investors who are part of an angel group. Because in an angel group, there's a way of going about investing, and it's always about smart money. It's always about getting people around the company who can really help the company to go forward. And that's in our interests if we've invested in the company. And that's also the way we feel that we should go about it. So angel investing, when it works well, brings tremendous connections, contacts, and hopefully wisdom that really helps a company to realize its potential. And that's the way we try to go about the work that we do. Yes. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I was just playing devil's advocate there. To tease out that issue, because I've acted for the other side of the fence as well, where it's an an impact investor or someone wanting to buy into a company. So I can see the value of what they bring. Often, like you say, the experience and the knowledge of, we've done this number of times and here's some key things, particularly like if you're going overseas, you know, there's some basic things that you could probably get right.
Yeah.
That's
all.
great. And so the way it works is you've got an angel group, like a number of investors that come together, and then I presume you've got like pitch evenings and things where people will come and present, and then if the group decides, they might collectively invest. Is that how it mainly works? Or
Enterprise Angels is a unique model of angel investing in New Zealand, in that most of the angel groups on the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States in particular are run by the members themselves. There's very little administration involved in those groups. So the members find the investment opportunities, bring them into a group, populate that opportunity amongst the other members, put together a due diligence team, secure the investment, and one of them gets put onto the board of the company. So very much run by the members themselves. That was a model that I knew was not going to work for our group, which is in Tauranga and Hamilton, so the Waikato and the Bay of Plenty. The difference between the U.S. groups and the groups here is in the U.S., 70-80% of the members are retired, and some of them are 30 years old and retired. So in other words, they're exited IT entrepreneurs largely. The groups in New Zealand, 90% of the members are all working.
Right.
So that plus New Zealanders are not Americans, which is a good thing. Americans can be absolutely rabid about things, and I knew New Zealanders the New Zealanders I was working with just weren't. Angel investing was important to them, but it wasn't their whole life. So we've established a managed model of angel investing. We have 6 staff, and we manage the entire process. And the strength of an angel group is the members, but it's not in turning the members into capital raising experts. It's drawing on the expertise that the members already have, because no matter what investment opportunity comes to us, we have members who have deep experience in that industry sector. And so it's drawing upon that expertise to guide the due diligence and then the company going forward. And it's also the confirmation that those people give when they invest into a company. If the 5 members of our group who have deep experience in the dairy industry are all investing their personal money into an investment opportunity, that sends a very strong signal to everyone else. And so that's where an angel group works the best. So we take all that load of term sheet negotiation, the legals and all that stuff. We take that off the members. My staff does all that. I'm used to saying my staff. I've recently been. I've recently stepped aside as executive director of Enterprise Angels. Nina Lolevra is now, who's from Christchurch, by the way, is now the CEO, and I've taken on the executive chair role.
Oh, that's good. That's helpful, though, to think through the different models and understand the differences. And, you know, I can understand that different cultural ways of doing things as well and different approaches. So can you just tell us a little bit about this new fund? What was the genesis for that, and what are you aiming for with it? Because I know it's got a unique, that word purpose, it's got a unique approach. So could you just describe about what that's about?
You bet. So that's a nice segue. So my move into the executive chair role of Enterprise Angels is to free up my time so that I can put it into my next passion, which is Purpose Capital Impact Fund and impact investing. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I turned to my board and I said, you have to have a raging fire to be driving angel investing the way I've been doing for the past 10 years. And I can tell that the fire is starting to burn down a bit. And maybe that's because I'm the kind of person that loves a challenge in the early years and loves establishing things or whatever it is. But it was the case. So I said to the board, we should start thinking about a succession plan. And so I started looking around at what else I might do. And I started to look more and more at impact investing, and I realized that in some ways New Zealand was once again in the place that it was 10 years ago with angel investing, which was why the heck aren't we doing this here? It's been going on for 20 years in the States, and it's raging away in Europe, and nothing's happening in New Zealand, formally, as called impact investing. And so I can't help myself. For me, it was a wonderful. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to do things that I regard as being more of a reflection of who I am, but also in creating more of a capital D difference. Because what always drives me in anything I do is can I make a difference? So impact investing, because its primary focus is social and environmental change. I just felt it was just obvious for me as the next thing that I would do. So started to research that a lot. Went to a couple of SOCAPs. So if listeners are aware, SOCAP is the granddaddy of all impact investing events, which happens in San Francisco each Northern Hemisphere fall, September, October. 3,500 people. It's a wonderful event. So I started going to events like that and started really exploring and learning about impact. And then I started reflecting on what I thought would work in New Zealand at this very, very early stage of things. I was aware of Jamie Newth's great work in establishing Soul Capital, and I was aware of Akina and Newground Capital as they established Impact Enterprise Fund. And so I took some learnings from those, and probably the main one of the main first learnings or points was I felt, in looking around the world and talking to other people, I felt that the philanthropic sector in New Zealand needed to lead into this work. The commercial sector is already doing what it does, and knowing the commercial sector as well as I do and high net worth individuals, I didn't feel without the philanthropic sector making a commitment to impact investing, I didn't think I would be able to get significant amounts of capital and assistance from them. So then I started thinking about, okay, well, where's philanthropic funds in New Zealand? And uniquely in all the world, most philanthropic wealth in New Zealand, albeit we have wonderful people like Stephen Tyndall and other family foundations, but most philanthropic wealth in New Zealand is held by the regional trusts. So I already had relationships, given that I've been in Tauranga for so long and done a lot of work in Hamilton, had relationships with those trusts. And so started to have a conversation with the trust managers to get a feeling for where they were at with impact investing, and also, very importantly, how far along the journey their trustees were. I was very fortunate in that Bay Trust, led by Alistair Rhodes, and Well Energy Trust, led by Raywin Jones, they themselves personally and therefore their trustees also were pretty aware of impact investing. And in fact, in the case of Bay Trust, we're already doing, let's call it impact investing in the form of loans and mechanisms like that. So I picked up the conversation with them and started painting a picture of what if I was able to bring the expertise of the commercial business and commercial investment sector into impact investing to guide impact investment decisions, and I was able to bring capital from that sector along with capital from the regional trusts. What if we were able to do that together and do impact investing, rather than what the trusts had historically done, which was take their entire corpus, all their wealth, and give that wealth to investment advisors who invested their funds all over the world, and then the small amount of income that came off that provide that income in the form of not-for-profit grants to not-for-profit organizations, which is doing very, very important community wealth. But 99% of the wealth of the regional trust was unavailable to benefit the community. Impact investing says to a regional trust, what if we took 1%, 2%, 3%? These regional trusts oftentimes have $500 million in wealth. What if we took a percentage of that and invested that into making a difference in the community, rather than just through the grant funding. Why don't we head down that route, informed by the commercial community on what's the best investment decisions, and let's see if we can't really apply that wealth, more of that wealth, to make more of a difference in New Zealand. And so we've been successful in that. Well Energy Trust, TECT, and Bay Trust have all committed $5 million each to Purpose Capital Impact Fund. Eastland Community Trust is in the process of due diligence. The trustees have approved a $5 million investment. And there are other trusts that we're talking to. But at this stage, we're really focusing now on the corporate sector and high net worths, because I really, really believe and know that we can bring capital from that sector as well to impact investing.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I agree with you. It's kind of, because we were at the Philanthropy New Zealand event in May, right? And there was a session about impact investing. And the mood in the room, certainly it felt like this is a way forward. Rather than, because like you say, some of these trusts and others have literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And you look at what's being invested in and think, if you could leverage that, what an impact that would actually make.
Exactly.
Which ultimately comes back to a common word that we've bandied around before, which is social enterprise. You know, the idea that a business can actually affect change through its business model. And that's what you're really talking about, isn't it? That impact investing can empower companies to then make change.
Very simply, impact investing in that investment model for investment return is completely inappropriate for many things. But there are initiatives, there are projects, there are businesses that are involved or can be involved in driving social or environmental change, where running that initiative with those commercial business and investment disciplines not only stabilizes that initiative, but it allows it to scale. Because it's no longer having to rely solely on handouts in the form of grant funding or government funding, but it now is able to become self-generating, and it can scale, it can attract more capital. So just in the way commercial ventures look to be able to scale to increase their profits and their customer base, we can use that same model and tweak it and help to scale environmental and social change.
Yeah, that's great. So the in terms of what you're aiming for, like the total value of the fund that you're targeting, that would be interesting to hear. And then what are you going to look to invest in? What's going to be the criteria? How do you work out if something is going to have impact or not?
It's a $20 to $30 million fund, and unlike the Impact Enterprise Fund, I knew that I would be much harder to get the trusts on board if the investments looked somewhat risky, and therefore it's not a private equity type fund like Impact Enterprise Fund, which has about I think a 15% target return rate. It's entirely appropriate that a fund like that is in the marketplace, but I couldn't get those trusts to invest in one like that. So it's a 6% net of fees IRR return fund. It will be focused on asset-backed investments, so not investments into early stage social enterprise. Angel investors will support that. We've surveyed the Enterprise Angels members, and many of them are anxiously looking for those types of opportunities to invest in. So I'm very confident that we'll get support for early stage social enterprise from angel investors. But Purpose Capital Fund will have to stick with things like commercial models that we understand very, very well. And the three that I could highlight are the dairy sector, the horticulture sector, and property.
Right.
And rather than taking idealistic ideas out of the sky and trying to create a business model around them, we're looking at working through business models that we understand very, very well commercially, and using those business models as Trojan horses for delivering the social or environmental change. So in the dairy sector, for instance, finding the top most motivated dairy farmers who really want to make the environmental and efficiency gains on farm, who understand innately what they should be doing, but simply don't have the capital, because one of the reasons because the banks are retracting from the dairy sector. They don't have the capital to implement that change. So we would go in, we would enable them to make those changes, apply the equipment systems to be able to do that. And we would then use those farms as models that could be emulated by other dairy farmers to really try to push the sector to really take the pressure off the environmental damage that the sector is currently doing. Horticulture, so that's an environmental focus. In the horticulture sector, we see a lot of potential for social benefit and social change, primarily working with Maori. There are already some really interesting models in the Eastern Bay of Plenty and the Gisborne region in the horticulture sector, gold kiwi fruit, and others, the Miro Berry Initiative. So working very closely with Maori to deliver sticky social change in areas where there's multi-generational problems and issues. And if we have time, I could give you a brief example on that. So an initiative that's been going for a year or two is called Hua Kiwi, and that's where financiers will discuss with Maori the utilization of Maori land, which currently may be fallow or maybe growing maize, a low income crop, and put the gold kiwi fruit infrastructure on that Maori-owned land. Bring in kiwi fruit managers to manage that, and partner with Maori, providing employment and training as part of that. The financiers, after year 11, 12, will have achieved their financial return on that, and they will simply walk away from that development, and the development is forevermore owned by Maori on Maori-owned land, which is, a couple of years ago as a commercial person, I would have thought, well, that sounds great. That's a real win-win. And it is great in many ways, but so much more can be done with a project like that. So Purpose Capital investing into a project like that would first of all consult deeply with Maori as to how we could use this to really cause lasting change in their community. And then we'd turn to the financiers and say, okay, you've modeled this to get the return in year 11. What if we make it year 12? And what if we do these things? How proud would we feel about that? So we hope to be able to use horticulture in that kind of way. And then, of course, property, as everyone knows. We most likely will be looking at innovative models of social housing, potentially co-housing and cooperative housing as well, which I know is there's a growing number of models of that in Auckland, Queenstown, here in Christchurch.
That's great. Well, I mean, it's going to be fascinating to watch it develop. And the thing that strikes me is I keep hearing words like social enterprise and people get confused about what it means. But I view it as just one example or one symptom of a paradigm shift of thinking that's happening. And I think impact investing is another example of this sort of new way of thinking intergenerationally, using stewardship, kaitiakitanga, guardianship that we aren't inheriting from our parents, we're holding on trust for our children. And not to put it too simplistically or make it sound all airy-fairy and beautiful rainbows and things, but that actually there is a paradigm shift happening of thinking among people who have resources and have wealth, and that we might actually see a shift and a change. And I see this as an example of that. So
yes.
Yeah. Well, what we've got coming up is we're going to have some people come in and hear you share about your journey and things. So we need to finish off the podcast. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing a bit about what you're involved in. I can see real echoes of it through your life, which is always, it's not surprising, but it's always nice to see that. And if people are interested, what I'll do is video the session that we're about to have with the people here in Canterbury, and then they'll be able to watch that video as well. But thank you so much for coming on the show.
Ben, thanks so much for the work you're doing, Steve, and for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.